All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to January's Virtual Parlor Chat, where we are talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his time in Harlem with Dr. Traci Parker. We are so excited for this. We're going to give everyone about 30 seconds to a minute to join. In the meantime, we'll go over some brief logistics. My name is Maddie Mungo. I am the Public Programs and Visitor Services Manager here at Morris-Jumel Mansion, and also your lovely host for the evening. You, as a participant, do not have access to the chat, but you do have access to the Q&A feature. So if you have a question, no need to hesitate to wait till the end. Pop that in the Q&A, and when we have time at the end for questions, I will read those out. So if you have any questions, pop those in there. Similarly, if you have any technical issues, if you have a friend who's on the other line saying, I can't get into the Zoom, email marketing@morrisjumel.org and we can help you out with that. But I will go ahead and get started with my own plugging. You know how I love to plug our programs, how much I love our programs. And I am so excited to share our Family and Community Day for February, which is going to be Victorian Valentine's Love Throughout Black History. This is going to be February 10th, second Saturday every month. If you love crafts, if you have kids, if you know kids, if you've heard of kids, we'd love to see you, love to have you participate in our free craft every second Saturday, Victorian Valentine's. I know this is a fan favorite this coming February. Similarly, upcoming virtual parlor chats, you know them, you love them, every third Wednesday. Here are the dates for the next few months. If you want to pop those into your calendar, or also easy to remember, third Wednesday every month. We have some really interesting talks in the works right now. You're not going to want to miss these. So just some things to keep in mind. For those of you who are not familiar with the mansion, hello. This is Morris-Jumel Mansion. This is the oldest house left in Manhattan, built in 1765 for a man named Roger Morris and his wife, Mary Phillips Morris. The house was very likely built with enslaved labor, almost assuredly ran and funded with enslaved labor. To learn more about those individuals, we invite you to check out Life Below Stairs, our newest exhibition, as well as the virtual parlor chat from November, also on Life Below Stairs, the exhibition. After the Morrises, the house is used as Washington's headquarters. George Washington for about 5 weeks in the fall of 1776. Then after that, used as the British headquarters for the remainder of the Revolution. After they leave, then Eliza Jumel comes in, marries the former Vice President Aaron Burr, kicks him out. Hires Anne Northup, whose husband Solomon will go on to write 12 Years a Slave. Lots of history in the house, but also history very close by. One thing I want to shout out, especially in regards to our topic tonight, is our proximity to 555 and 409 Edgecombe. 555 Edgecombe, our next door neighbor. Both of these buildings known for housing some of the more famous Harlem Renaissance luminaries, Paul Robeson, Duke Ellington, Thurgood Marshall, W.E.B. Du Bois, Walter White, founder of the NAACP. Really just a lot of incredibly important people in these two buildings. If you want to learn more, the nonprofit While We Are Still Here is a nonprofit that we're looking to preserve these two buildings and Harlem history as a whole, protecting it against gentrification. Very, very important work, and a very cool website if you want to learn more about these buildings. I just learned so much today when I was getting the history, so I really recommend checking them out and supporting. Tonight, we have the absolute honor of talking to Dr. Traci Parker. She is an associate professor of African American history in the Department of History at the University of California, Davis. She is currently on fellowship as a Charles Warner Center for the Studies of American History Faculty Fellow at Harvard University. During her tenure at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies, she published her first book, Department Stores and the Black Freedom Movement, Workers, Consumers, and Civil Rights from the 1930s to 1980s, which was named a 2019 Choice Outstanding Academic Title. She's the co-editor of the New Civil Rights Movement Reader, Resistance, Resilience, and Justice. She is currently writing Beyond Loving, Love, Sex, and Marriage in the Black Freedom Movement and editing a collection of essays on love, sex, and relationships in the 20th and 21st century United States. Her work has received the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanford Humanities Center, W.E.B. Du Bois Institute / Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University, Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, among others. She holds a PhD and MA from the University of Chicago and a BA in history from Cornell University. So very excited to talk with her, very excited to hear her talk with us about Dr. Martin Luther King and his time in Harlem. So I will let her now take it away.
Thank you, Maddie. That was such a warm and wonderful introduction. And thank you again for inviting me to speak today. We're coming off the heels of Martin Luther King Day. And so I'm happy, I'm still in celebratory mode. So I'm happy to be here to celebrate it with all of you. When I was thinking about today's talk, I was thinking about how we imagine King in general, right? And so typically when we think about King, we recognize two major things. First, his commitment to the Christian doctrine of love and nonviolence, both morally and practically, as potent weapons available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. And second, we remember his leadership in the Southern Black freedom movement, right? Where he and thousands of ordinary people from all walks of life dismantled the formal codified system of racial apartheid known as Jim Crow. What I think sometimes gets lost or forgotten or simply downplayed is King's reach and influence and activism beyond the South. Early in his career as a minister and activist, he'd been engaged and worked with Northern Black communities, and he had visited Harlem and parts of New York on numerous occasions. So in 1962, in September of that year, he attended an event of the New York State Civil Rights Centennial Commission to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. In 1963, he spoke at City College of New York's commencement. In July 1964, King met with local Black leaders and Mayor Robert Wagner Jr. about the Harlem riots and how they could be stopped. In December of 1964, Mayor Wagner honored King with a medallion for his Nobel Peace Prize, and King attended a rally in Harlem. And in 1965, 1 month after Selma March, he spoke before the New York Bar Association in Midtown. One of his last times coming to New York was actually in February of 1968, where he gave a glowing tribute to W.B. Du Bois on his 100th birthday at Carnegie Hall. His relationship with Harlem, however, was sometimes fraught. See, Harlem, like other Northern Black enclaves, was a place where the civil rights movement had been in motion for decades. So when we think about Harlem, we think about the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work movement in the 1930s and move forward. This was a place where anti-discrimination laws had long been on the books. And so the Black freedom struggle was and had to be different by the 1950s, 1960s in Harlem. The people in Harlem and other urban cities were frustrated. They were isolated, they were angry. Their woes were not identical to their brothers and sisters in the South. What many of them were suffering from was economic deprivation. They were under or unemployed. They faced employment discrimination, poor schools, and housing discrimination. And King didn't always understand their needs or them. And they, Harlemites, didn't always understand King and his devotion to nonviolence. And yet he still continued to visit and not only speak about the importance of nonviolence and love, but also visibly practice them. Also, during his time in Harlem and his encounters with the people of Harlem, these things changed him, and they would tremendously influence his last and final campaign, which was the Poor People's Campaign. I want to spend the little bit of time that I have with you today considering three moments that sort of speak to this, right? Not only that speak to how he valued and implemented nonviolence and love, but also how Harlem would shape his activism and who he was as a man. And these three moments are his bookstore stop in 1958, his visit to Salem Methodist Church in 1963, and finally his denunciation of the Vietnam War at the Riverside Church in 1967, exactly 1 year before his assassination. Slide, please. Thank you. So the first instance occurs on Saturday, September 20th, 1958. Now, the day before, King had been attending a rally outside of Harlem's Hotel Teresa to support the Youth March for Integrated Schools. That Saturday, however, he was at Bloomstein's department store on West 25th Street, signing copies of his newly released Stride Toward Freedom, the Montgomery Story. Stride Toward Freedom was a memoir of the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, it was a bit unusual that he was at Bloomstein's because the department store did not sell books. Also, being at the department store had caused a bit of friction among the locals because he had turned down the opportunity to hold the signing at a Black Nationals bookstore. That day, King set up at a desk in the back of the shoe department, and he's surrounded by New York civic leaders, mostly African Americans and Jews, all of whom were dressed smartly in their best clothes, hats, and jewels. And you've got a photographer capturing the day. Slide, please. And so this is all going down when Zola Curry, who also was elegantly dressed in a stylish suit, and she's got her jewelry, her sequins, cat eyeglasses, she enters the store armed with a loaded .25 caliber automatic pistol and a letter opener. The pistol was secretly tucked away in her bra, and the letter opener was in her handbag. And she pushes her way through the crowd to the table where Dr. King sat. Are you Martin Luther King? The 42-year-old woman, a native of Georgia, asked. And the way she asked, Coretta Scott King describes it later in her own autobiography, that her voice was dripping with anger. He replied, "Yes, I am," not looking up from the book he was signing. She then said, "Luther King, I've been looking for you for 5 years." Within moments, King felt a sharp plunge forcefully into his chest. Curry lunged at him with a 7-inch ivory-handled steel letter opener, stabbing him in the chest, piercing his sternum. The hone point stopped just a fraction of an inch from his aorta. Slide. King was rushed to Harlem Hospital where the blade was removed. Dr. Aubrey Maynard, chief of surgery, later told King and his wife, quote, "The razor tip of the blade had been touching Martin's aorta, and his whole chest had to be opened to remove it," end quote. Maynard also told them, quote, "If you had sneezed during all those hours of waiting, your aorta would have been punctured, and you would have drowned in your own blood." Coretta recalls in her autobiography that because of the way the weapon had been inserted, the surgeon had to remove it by making 2 incisions that left a cross-shaped scar on Martin's chest. Slide. "10 days after the stabbing, King gave a short statement to reporters and later an announcement where he thanked his doctors and hospital staff, and he shared his gratitude for the outpouring of love, support, and prayers that came from politicians, religious leaders, worshipers in churches and synagogues all around the country and the world. In fact, it's estimated that he received about 800 cards, letters, and telegrams. And in his statement, or his announcement that comes later in the day, he expressed a forgiveness and a grace. He said, "Let me say that I feel no ill will toward Miss Isola Curry, and know that thoughtful people will do all in their power to see that she needs the help she apparently needs if she's going to become a free, constructive member of society. The pathetic aspect of this experience is not the injury of one individual. It demonstrates that a climate of hatred and bitterness so permeates areas of our nation that inevitably deeds of extreme violence must erupt. Today it is I, tomorrow it could be another leader, or any man, woman, or child who will be the victim of lawlessness and brutality. I hope that this experience proves to be socially constructive by demonstrating the urgent necessity for nonviolence to govern affairs of men. Through these days, I have been increasingly able to understand more deeply the hard blows and tragic suffering so many of my people and other members of minority groups experience, all too often and without cause or reason. The experience of these last few days have deepened my faith in the relevance of the spirit of nonviolence, if necessary social change is peacefully to take place. Through experience, I now come to see more clearly the redemptive power of nonviolence. I have been brought to see its wider social significance. I am now convinced that if the Negro holds fast to the spirit of nonviolence, our struggle and example will challenge and help redeem not only America, but the world. Martin's it's surprising. You're talking about a man who almost dies. He has children at the time. His wife has to fly from out of town to visit him. And yet he's so forgiving and loving towards Curry. It's clear to him that something deeper is going on with him. It's also clear to him that there's a anger, a frustration, that there's great harm going on that needs to be solved and addressed. Curry was indicted on October 17, 1958, of attempted first-degree murder. If convicted, she would have received 25 years in prison. But psychiatrists found that she had paranoid schizophrenia and an IQ of about 70, and so she was committed to a hospital near Poughkeepsie, New York. Now, Harlem is also a site where King's tensions with Black nationalists were very much on display. There's a point later in life where he reflects on the Curry situation, where he says, quote, "It may be that she had been around some of the meetings of these groups in Harlem, Black nationalist groups, that have me all the time as a favorite object of scorn. And hearing this over and over again, she may have responded to it when I came to Harlem." He then added, quote, "It may be that she was just so confused that she would have done this to anybody whose name was in the news. We will never know." Harlem's an interesting spot, right? Harlem is the city, the enclave of Malcolm X at this point in time, of the Nation of Islam, of Black Muslims and Black nationalists. This is the type of energy and fervor that's going around Harlem. Harlem had done that work in many ways, right? Of doing peaceful sit-ins, of doing boycotts. These things had been done in the 1920s, in the 1930s, and the 1940s, right? Just for many Harlemites, for many Black people who were living in this area, they were ready for more fast and immediate change. And so when King comes with his rhetoric of nonviolence, his practice of nonviolence, his feeling that we should love our neighbors even if they are harmful to us, it wasn't always well accepted. Slide. And one occasion occurred on Sunday, June 30th, 1963. Earlier that day, King actually had been in Brooklyn and he had been giving a speech. And during this, when he's speaking, he had actually criticized Black nationalism. That evening, he heads to Salem Methodist Church at 7th Avenue and 129th Street in Harlem to preach an evening sermon. And the sermon was supposed to sort of be this precursor. It's in anticipation of the March on Washington that would occur later that year in August. And as he's approaching the church in his car, and there's 500 people in attendance outside and 2,000 people in the church, his car's egged. Now, some believe, and even King to some degree, I think he has these thoughts, that it was Black nationalists who committed this act in retaliation for his comments earlier that day. He actually, once he gets inside the church, he tells the crowd, quote, "I can't understand what my colored brothers have against me. I've become accustomed to white mobs in Mississippi and Alabama, but I have not yet adjusted myself to what I just experienced in Harlem," end quote. And almost as soon as he says this out loud, he begins to reflect. It's very interesting. And he stops feeling rejected, right? There's part of him that feels rejected at this point, that he's being egged as he's coming into this beautiful church. And he starts to think about poverty and isolation and frustration. And he concludes that it's these elements that have caused people, residents, individuals to respond in this manner. Right? So these are the things that he's starting to really ponder, right? He's really starting to grapple with the problem of the United States is not simply a racial one, it's also economic. Next slide. Now, King comes in between numerous times, but I want to focus on one of the major times that he comes and gives one, in my opinion, one of his best speeches. And this happens on Tuesday, April 4th, 1967. And here he gives his most vocal denunciation of the Vietnam War for the first time. Now, King had always been a pacifist, and as you can guess, he was very much against American involvement in the Vietnam War. For years, he kept his disapproval to himself. And he actually, at one point in time, he tasked Coretta. Coretta's very much anti-war. She's a pacifist. She actually is more anti-war and comes out against it before Martin. And so she decides, the two of them, that she's going to take the helm on their anti-war stance and initiatives. Right? In the meantime, he's sort of behind closed doors, and when he's talking to folks of Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was his organization, and other allies, he's talking about that a settlement needs to be negotiated when it comes to the conflict abroad. He's reluctant to really say anything out loud, in large part because of his relationship with President Lyndon B. Johnson. President Lyndon B. Johnson is very much committed to this war, and he threatens to stop his support of the civil rights movement and King if King and other leaders go against him on the war. Now, this is at the same time, I just want to note that Lyndon B. Johnson is also working very closely with the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover to spy on, undermine, and neutralize King in the movement. But increasingly, King starts to feel the need that he has to speak out. And he starts to do so quietly, often in coded language. And then in late February 1967, he joins 4 anti-war senators at the Los Angeles Forum. And then in March, he decides he's going to participate in an anti-war march in Chicago. And at one point in time, he reflects that it was seeing images of Vietnamese children being burned by napalm that really moved him, that these were pictures that were seared in his memory. And he came to the conclusion that he could no longer remain silent on the war. He insisted that the war was destroying the soul of our nation, he says. So on Tuesday, April 4th, 1967, King finally decides to speak out when he's invited to speak at the Riverside Church in Manhattan. Now, the Riverside Church is a church with a long tradition of progressivism, and this wasn't the first time he spoke there. King had spoke at Riverside Church from 1959 to 1967. I think he said he had preached there almost every year during this period. And so it's on this day in early April. The church is packed. There's 2,700 pew spaces. There's 1,200 portable seats, and they're all filled. There's also an overflow line that stretches toward 120th Street. Oh, can we go back one? I'm so sorry. There we go. We can stay here for a second. Sorry. And as he is introduced and he steps into the pulpit, the audience rose to give him a standing ovation. As the ovation starts to die down, he imposed this deep quietness. And he begins what's going to end up being nearly an hour-long meditation on hesitant voices. And it's a speech that we now know as Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. And I just want to read you a couple of pieces from the speech because I just think summarizing King doesn't quite always do him justice. And so he gets up there, and shortly as after he begins, he says, I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because of my conscience leaves me no other choice. I join you in this meeting because I am in deepest agreement with the aims and works of the organization, which has brought us together, clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam. The recent statements of your executive committee are the sentiments of my own heart, and I found myself in accord when I read these opening lines. A time has come when silence is betrayal, and that time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. King goes on to declare that the Great Society, which was a set of domestic programs that sought, but ultimately failed, to eradicate racial injustice and poverty, that had been shot down, right? The Great Society not only had been shot down, but he says it had been shot down on the battlefields of Vietnam. He says exactly, quote, it would be very inconsistent for me to teach and preach nonviolence in this situation, and then applaud violence when thousands and thousands of people are being maimed and mutilated and many killed in this war. Now, King's not only talking about the Vietnamese being killed, but he's also talking about American soldiers being killed. And this is a theme you begin to see more and more from people on the street who are very angry about the country's involvement in this conflict. The poor, regardless of race, and I should say African Americans, when it comes to the Vietnam War, far outnumber other groups, right? It's African Americans in numbers are far disproportionate to their representation in the US public, right, that are fighting abroad. And they're the ones in the most dangerous positions and essentially become cannon fodder in the killing fields. Slide. So King's really attentive to the fact that not only the fact that we're at war, but those who are actually doing the work, who are on the ground, who are suffering, are the impoverished. They are those who are not as educated, right? They don't have college degrees, and they are poor, white and black, brown and yellow, right? They are everyone. And so he states, quote, I have now chosen to preach about the war in Vietnam today because I agree with Dante that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those in a period of moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. There comes a time when silence is betrayal. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformist thought within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world. Moreover, when the issues at hand seem as perplexing as they often do in the case of this dreadful conflict, we are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty. But we must move on. Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony. But we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate in our limited vision. But we must speak. When he ends, the crowd, the audience rose once again and gave King a standing ovation. But from across the political spectrum, including President Johnson, the speech drew widespread condemnation. The New York Times called Dr. King's remarks slanderous, right? It said that the moral issues of Vietnam are, quote, less clear-cut than he suggests. And it warned, quote, to divert the energies of the civil rights movement to the Vietnam issue is both wasteful and self-defeating. They say that especially given how the movement needs to confront what the paper called the intractability of slum wars and habits. Even some of the Black press criticized him. The Pittsburgh Courier, for example, wrote that Dr. King was tragically misleading African Americans on issues that were too complex for simple debate. King lost allies, some of them Black, some of them white, and the White House closed its door on King. right? No longer does President Johnson want to deal with King in any sort of way. He sees him as a traitor. But King was unmoved. He told his advisor and close friend and longtime progressive activist Stanley Levinson that, quote, I was politically unwise, but morally wise. I think I have a role to play, which may be unpopular, for I really feel that someone of influence has to say that the United States is wrong, and everybody is afraid to say it, end quote. Slide, please. Dr. King was indeed ahead of his time. And frankly, Coretta's ahead of Dr. King, right? So, but Dr. King is ahead of his time, but not for long. Within a year, anti-war sentiment pushed President Johnson out of his re-election bid. And today we remember the opposition to the war as widespread phenomenon, so much so that Dr. King's Riverside speech is often overlooked as just one more statement against an unpopular conflict. Harlem taught King a lot about the Black urban condition. And it tremendously informed what his final campaign was, right? The Poor People's Campaign, which he wanted to work with his wife, Coretta, and Ralph Abernathy to end poverty for all races. But more than that, or equally as important, King taught Harlem quite a bit about the importance of nonviolence and love. He comes to Harlem, he gets stabbed. He comes to Harlem, he's egged. He comes to Harlem on other occasions and he is talked about horribly by Black nationalists. And yet he continued to meet them and deal with them with love and forgiveness. The relationship that King had with Harlem should be celebrated today. And it should be remembered because it offers us invaluable insights into a man into the man who was king and his influence, as well as his personal struggles. It also reminds us that some of the woes that African Americans faced in the 1950s and 60s still remain with us and very much need to be addressed. And it is our job, right? It's our job now as citizens not to remain silent. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. And such an insight into him as a person. So I'll open it up for questions now. If anyone has any questions, you can put those into the Q&A and I will read them aloud. But I suppose I will start and I'll ask you, looking into this and thinking about, I suppose, just Dr. King as a person, what surprised you? Like, what took you aback? You're like, I didn't think of it that way, or put him in a new light, I suppose.
Yeah, I think, him getting stabbed is a big deal, right? There's so many times in which he and his family are in harm's way. And we forget sometimes, I think, that he is a man, right? That he's really grappling with what's going to happen in the movement. He's got to be fearful of what's going to happen with his family. He's away from them a good chunk of the time. In fact, some have said that, when he gets stabbed, this causes him to sort of wheeze, have breathing issues for the rest of his life. That he considers it to be a bit of a weakness. I think we forget that the difficulty and the stress he must have been under as he's dealing with the movement, right? It's easy to celebrate him now. It's become way too easy to take sort of pieces of different of his speeches and misconstrue them. But also to remember that he's very much a radical. He's not loved by everybody, right? He is an enemy of the US government in many ways. And he's very much a radical for his time. I just can't imagine, I've been writing a bit about his marriage with Coretta for this current book project. And I just can't imagine what type of day-to-day stress, right, that puts on him. I mean, he goes in the hospital several times because of stress during his life. There's moments where Coretta has to look at him and say, no, we need to go away for a bit because it's becoming so impactful that it's taking a physical toll on him, that he has anxiety, he's depressed, he goes through bouts of depression. I think it's really important to remember these things.
Yeah. Um, I suppose, do you think had he, and certainly he was a very busy man, but do you think had he come to Harlem or to these Black enclaves in New York City
Mhm.
more frequently, do you think he would have had more inroads with his, I suppose you could use the word enemies up here, his opposition, people who were egging him and stabbing
Mhm.
him? That might have been something else, but do you think there was sort of a universe where he could have connected more with Harlem?
I mean, he connects quite a bit with Harlem. I mean, he's there. I mean, it was as I was trying to map it out, he's there quite a bit. Um, but he's also everywhere, right? He's in Los Angeles way more than we've actually, as historians, have documented. He's in Chicago at one point in time. You know, he starts the Chicago Freedom Movement, and he thought Chicago would be the place to kickstart his open housing movement to push against housing discrimination, to help the poor. He really is. It's clear that he is thinking about the urban problem, right? The urban problems. He's just trying, you know, he's a man who can't be everywhere at once. Um, and he's starting to turn in that direction as the civil rights movement goes on. But there's just so many things to do. I mean, I just can't even imagine, right? There's so many things to do. You're sitting there trying to vote for Voting Rights Act in 65. You got Birmingham in 63. You're doing a march in Washington the same year. Um, and he's got, you know, SCLC helps start Operation Breadbasket that's supposed to, you know, help hunger and get people jobs. And it's just, he's having those conversations. He's having these thoughts. He really, and the Poor People's Campaign really is his way of trying to unite his concerns about racial injustice and economic injustice. Um, but I do think that being in Harlem and being in all of these urban centers are really, they're impactful about how he really is thinking about the African American issue, the African American experience in this country.
Yeah. Do you think you could talk just a little bit more on the Poor
Mm-hmm.
People's Campaign? I know, at least in my experience, that was something that we did not talk about in my, primary and secondary education. It was very much like, and then he said, I had a dream and he fixed everything. So I wonder if, just for the benefit of our audience, you could talk a little bit more about that, and then maybe some of the other things that he did that we don't know as well.
Sure. So the Poor People's Campaign is something that, you know, he really, you know, in some ways, in going through Coretta's personal records recently, it's clear that he's having these conversations with his wife often. And she, in fact, is way more progressive than him from the jump. I mean, when they meet, um, and she's very anti-war. She's had this relationship with Shirley Du Bois, and she's interacted with Paul Robeson, and you know, he's sitting there talking about Marxism on their first date, and she knows all this, right? And so she is already interested and very well educated when it comes to class conflict. It's about maybe 65, 66, 1966, that he's starting to think that the next direction that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference has to go in has to be about eradicating poverty. Now, this coincides with the fact that Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society um, is 64, 65, right? And as I mentioned, the Great Society was that set of domestic programs that was aimed at trying to totally eliminate. I mean, the idea was that it would totally eliminate racial injustice and poverty, right? And so he starts thinking about what this program would look like. The problem is that he doesn't get a chance to see it happen, to come to fruition, really. He's assassinated in 1968. It's Coretta who takes up the reins and moves it forward. Ralph Abernathy does some work as well, but he struggles. He's not as charismatic. Some have said, and I don't know whether this is to be true, some have said that he wasn't as much of an intellectual as King. It's also clear that those in SCLC didn't have the same type of respect for Ralph Abernathy as they had for King. But King gets some pushback when it comes to the Poor People's Campaign. Bayard Rustin, for example, doesn't think this is the way to go. But King really is adamant about it. And he begins writing about it, and he's talking about it, and he's preaching about it. But it's Coretta who ends up having to take up the reins. I mean, just days after he's shot in Memphis and assassinated, she's back down there dealing with this. One of his last major campaigns is the Memphis sanitation worker strike, right? Where he's marching alongside sanitation workers as they try to unionize, as they try to get better benefits, as they try to get better wages. He understands the idea that to some degree, when it came to the Southern movement, because the primary focus had to be on eradicating Jim Crow, right? Getting rid of it into the public sphere, right? Dealing with holding sit-ins, trying to get people to sit in at lunch counters. If you notice, there's a progression to how that movement goes, right? We get rid of race discrimination, segregation in the public sphere. We then move on to legislation. We then move on to what economic discrimination. This is really sort of his evolution of thought. But the Memphis sanitation workers strike really, I think, exemplifies what he thought. One of the ways he imagined the Poor People's Campaign would go forward. Coretta will spend the rest of her life being an activist, right? And a lot of the activism that she's involved in is not only about anti-racism, but also on behalf of laborers. She works with hotel worker unions. She works with domestic workers. She's really much involved in trying to ensure that people have quality jobs, well-paying jobs, jobs that would allow them to have a living wage. And she's very much involved in women's rights and gay liberation. I mean, she's and it makes you wonder whether if King had lived, right, whether he would be standing by her side, right, as she sort of leads the way into what the movement, right, broadly construed should look like.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. We have a question from Gregory, who is one of our lovely volunteers, who is sharing that he was present at King's visit to Convent Ave Baptist Church in March of 1968. Wow. And that he had spoken that evening about the Poor People's Campaign, but didn't mention the Vietnam War. And he's wondering if this was maybe on purpose, considering the bad press from the Riverside Church speech.
That's a good question. I actually don't know. I know that in 68, he's speaking about the Vietnam War elsewhere. That's a great question. I really don't know. It's something I have to look into. In all of my readings of King, his personal papers and Coretta's personal papers, I haven't seen anything mentioned as to why he would not speak about the Vietnam War at the time.
Interesting. Well, I can tell sort of in how you talk about Coretta, how much you seem to admire her, at least admire her activism. And I suppose I can use that as a segue into talking about your book work on love and marriage and the Black freedom movement. And I'm just so curious if you could talk a little bit. I know it's off topic, but if you could talk a little bit about it, and sort of what you're looking at, what you're thinking about, that kind of thing.
So, and I will try to tie it back to King. That might be helpful. So the book looks at how it looks at the role of romantic love in the civil rights movement, right? A lot of work has been done, as I talked about today, on the importance of brotherly love, right, as sort of the crux of nonviolent activism, nonviolent tactics. But you look at the civil rights movement and you're thinking about the youth movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panthers. These are really young people. And they are in the midst of the movement at the same time that the sexual revolution is exploding, that there's just so many other movements going around that they are, in a sense, grappling with how they should organize their lives, right? Also, to be an activist, for many of them, I've interviewed a number of them, what the first thing they talk about is that their first priority was the movement, nothing else, right? There's a in 1961 when Diane Nash decides to go down to the Freedom Rides. She actually signs her last will and testament. That's a big deal. She's only, she's 19, 20 at the time, something. She's very young to sign your last will and testament because you don't think you're going to live. So, in many ways, if you don't think you're going to live, you sort of have the room to experiment with who you are and who you want to be. But also, part of this project has been about how the federal government, state governments, the FBI have weaponized Black love to undermine the movement. So, for example, right before King gets his Nobel Peace Prize abroad, he's staying in DC, and they bug his room. During the bug, right, supposedly they find information of King engaging in extramarital affairs and drinking and carrying on as one might do with with his buddies. And they take that tape and they mail it to Coretta Scott King. Now, she doesn't get the tape until well after they return from abroad, right? They go abroad, they come back, they go to New York, they then go to DC, and then they go back home. And she says she's sitting at her kitchen table. She's sort of going through, as you can imagine, all the mail that may have piled up while they've been gone. And she sees this recording and a note. And she goes to play the recording. And so she claimed in her autobiography that she didn't hear Martin's voice on the tape. And so she gives the tape to Martin. Martin says he listens to the tape and he's like, oh no, I hear myself. Andrew Young, I think, listens to the tape. He's got Ralph Abernathy who listened to the tape, and they're like, yes, he's on this tape. Now, whether he had an extramarital affair during this visit, I don't know. I don't actually really care. What's interesting to me is the fact that the FBI would go to such lengths to destroy his marriage with the idea that if they destroy the bond between him and Coretta, it would weaken him as a man, it would weaken him as a leader, and it would weaken the movement. And so it becomes, to me, this becomes this key moment where the FBI starts leveraging Black love, weaponizing Black love against African Americans. They do it with the Black Panthers. They send in informants to sleep with Panthers to try to get information, to try to infiltrate the group, to weaken it from the inside. And this is at the same time that the country is having discussions. The Moynihan report comes out, is having discussions about how that they're concerned about Black motherhood because there's so many single Black mothers, and they're concerned about the Black family, and yet they are attacking it from within.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So it's just this interesting sort of like, maybe paradox isn't the word I'm looking for, but to so devalue Black love societally, but at the same time hold it as something so important. They know like we can take down the movement by destroying Black love. That's a fascinating sort of juxtaposition societally to have. I'm curious to know what brought you to that research. Like, what was your like, I have to look into this more, I have to see more?
It's funny. So I just finished the first book on department stores. I spend a lot of time talking about department stores in Harlem because they become sort of this battleground for labor rights, Black labor rights in the early half of the 20th century. And I'm actually sitting around with my husband and his mother, and she's packing up to leave Chicago. And she starts telling us about her marriage, right? She's been divorced for a long time. And she's telling us about her time as a volunteer for the Panthers. And this is all new to me, right? Like, how tidbits of information about people, but this is all new to me. And she's talking about how she met her ex-husband while driving a bus that would take family members to prisons in Illinois. And that's how she met him. He was part of the Rockford Panthers, and she was out of Chicago, and they fell in love that way. And so you start I think as a historian, sometimes we just sort of go down the trail of like asking, well, what happened? Like, or did this happen for other people? And I just started thinking. And so, really, my first entry into this was thinking about the Panthers. And as I was combing through their newsletters, what they were featuring periodically was what they call revolutionary marriages and this idea of revolutionary love. And revolutionary love for them was that when you found someone you loved, you didn't have to get married under the eyes of the state, right? There was no need to go get a certificate because the state had forever interfered with Black marriages and Black families and Black love since back going back to slavery. That wasn't necessary, but you could if you wanted to. But the key was is that when you married, you understood you weren't just marrying the person that you're with, right? Your partner. You were also marrying the movement, and that you had to prioritize the movement above all else. And this is how they operated. And it's an interesting idea to think about revolutionary love to not simply be this love you have for your for mankind, for your brother, your sister, your fellow man, but to think about revolutionary love in a more romantic sense. That type of love, that type of romantic love that is the basis for creating families, for coupling, could also be a tool or a tactic for the movement. And so that's how, and so it sort of has evolved from there. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame you. That would lead anyone down a fascinating rabbit hole. Gregory actually has a statement to share also,
Mm-hmm.
that Dr. King's surgery at Harlem Hospital was a source of controversy, that Dr. Maynard, while officially credited with saving Dr. King, it was actually Dr. Naclerio, perhaps,
Mm-hmm.
Naclerio, that and another surgical resident who actively saved Dr. King's life. This is a situation that to this day is whispered about among the staff in the operating room at the Harlem Hospital.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Because even in speaking about, and Coretta devotes quite a bit of time talking about the stabbing in her own papers, she mentions Dr. Maynard. There is no mention of anyone else. And so thank you, Gregory. I appreciate that.
Yeah, certainly something. There might be something whispered that you could
That's it.
track down. Um, you mentioned, and this could be a whole other virtual parlor chat, but you mentioned the labor movements in the department stores in Harlem, and I wonder if you could talk a little about that since we're talking about Harlem.
Sure.
If you could talk a little about that.
Oh, yeah, happily. So I find, I wrote this book about department stores, and department stores is simply a lens into which to understand how civil rights activists remain committed to economic discrimination from the turn of the 20th century through the 1970s into the 1980s. Their tactics may have changed along the way, but it's important to recognize. And so the department stores are interesting because it's sort of the training ground for what happens in Montgomery, right? And the Montgomery bus boycott, that in its essence a consumer boycott. What happens in Harlem in 1934 is a boycott of the department store, Bloomstein's department store. They withhold their dollars because the department store, while situated in Harlem and had been profiting from African American customers for many years, had refused to hire African Americans in positions of responsibility. And so at that point in time, that would have been sales work, that would have been clerical work, that would have been being a manager, managerial work. There's a refusal. And so they withhold their dollars in order to force management to make a change. And they're quite successful. I mean, they make such a dent in the profits that the store is forced to integrate. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at the image of the people who integrate the store, they're all so fair that they could have passed. Not only are they very fair, right? And they're fair and they look very European features in many ways, right? As to not, I think management believed that wouldn't upset their white clientele. But also, the people they hire are overqualified, right? The white people who work at the store might have a high school degree. The black people who get hired are college educated. Some of them have, MAs or MBAs. I mean, they're overqualified. But this is often the case when it came to the first that integrate any space in this country. And so the, what they do is they don't buy where you can't work. This movement in 1934 is part of this larger movement of the Don't Buy Work Can't Work campaign that actually kickstarted in Chicago in 1929. And then it spreads like wildfire to New York, Harlem in particular, to Baltimore, to DC, down to Virginia, to Detroit. It is one of the first major movements where African Americans are able to leverage their dollars to force change, especially on the front of labor. And the reason why they can do it at that moment in the 1930s, is because there are more African Americans living in cities, right? So you've had this movement, large movement of Black Southerners to Harlem, to Bronzeville in Chicago, to Detroit, right? And they're congregating in these Black enclaves. When they get to these places, they get better jobs. They're no longer tied to the land. It's not plantation work. They're also able to go to schools all year round, right? We forget that when you're living in the South, oftentimes you don't get a full school year of education, right? You're forced to work. And so they're more money, they're more educated, and they have this energy, this mindset that they could do something, right? They can do something to better their lives. And so, what happens at Bloomstein's is something that has a long impact when it comes to the Black freedom struggle.
Fascinating. You learn something new every day. So we are winding down on our time. And if anyone has like one last question that they want to ask, you have some time before I take it from you. But I'll ask, making sure no one is actively typing, but I will ask something I ask most everyone in a conclusion and sort of, museums we love, a take-home message. So I'm wondering if there is one thing sort of in this topic, in thinking about Dr. King and thinking about Harlem and the Black Freedom Movement, that you would have all of our guests sort of take home and sit with and think about what that would be and what you hope they take home.
My first thought is, I think there's a lesson in how King moves, right? He sits with the problem. And I'm thinking particularly about, if you notice with every issue, he sort of sits with it. He's gracious with it. He leads with love, right? He leads with these Christian principles and doctrines. But he always speaks up, right? Like it's such an important lesson to not be silent. Right? And you cannot be silent in really productive ways. And I think that's the lesson of King. Or the one of many lessons of King, I will say that.
Yes, I think that is very wise, and definitely something that we can all take home, sit with, think about, and apply to our own lives and our own activism today. But unless anyone has any last minute super fast questions, I think we can go ahead and say thank you for
Thank you.
joining us this evening. Dr. Parker is so fascinating. Very, very important stuff, and learning new things every day. And I'm so glad that you were able to share with us. And thank you to all of our participants for joining us. This will be recorded and put onto YouTube. Hopefully within the next week. You know how we are with deadlines, but hopefully we're going to get it out within a week, but it will be out eventually. And I will then take this opportunity to say, have a great night, everyone. Stay warm out there. If it is cold where you are, it is certainly cold where I am. So bundle up, stay warm, and we will see you in February. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.